James Taylor settled into his first-class seat on Flight 237, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. After 5 days of back-to-back meetings in Chicago, he was finally heading home to Atlanta. As the CEO of Horizon Security Solutions, one of the country's leading cybersecurity firms, James rarely got a moment to himself. These quiet minutes before takeoff were precious. Today, he'd skipped his usual business attire, opting instead for dark jeans, a navy sweater, and comfortable loafers. No tie, no blazer, no pretense. Just a man eager to get home to his family, after a long week away. James pulled out his tablet, planning to review some quarterly reports before the flight attendants came around for the pre-takeoff drink service. The cabin was filling up with the usual first-class crowd, mostly business people in various states of exhaustion, a few dressed in designer clothes that screamed old money. A flight attendant with a blonde ponytail and a name tag reading Lisa made her rounds, greeting passengers with practiced smiles. James noticed something shift in her expression when she reached his row. The warm welcome she'd offered to others cooled noticeably. "Excuse me, sir, can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone clipped. James looked up, slightly surprised. He'd already had his boarding pass scanned at the gate, just like everyone else. He glanced around and noticed she hadn't asked to see anyone else's boarding pass in first class. "Sure," he replied calmly, pulling up the digital pass on his phone. "Here you go." Lisa studied the boarding pass with unusual intensity, as if searching for some flaw or mistake. James watched her face, recognizing a look he'd seen countless times before, the look that said, "You don't belong here?" "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. "No, no problem," Lisa replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. She handed back his phone and moved, on without another word. James took a deep breath and returned to his reports, pushing away the nagging feeling that had followed him his entire career. The feeling that no matter how high he climbed, how successful he became, some people would always question his right to occupy certain spaces. Less than 5 minutes later, Lisa returned with another flight attendant, a man with gelled hair and a name tag reading Brian. They stood in the aisle next to James's seat, whispering to each other while occasionally glancing his way. Their attempt at discretion was undermined by their obvious stares. Brian approached James with an air of authority that seemed exaggerated for the situation. "Sir, we seem to have an issue with the seating arrangements," Brian said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. James looked up again, his patience beginning to wear thin. "What kind of issue?" "My boarding pass shows seat 3A, which is this seat right here." He kept his voice level, conscious of how quickly a black man showing any sign of frustration could be labeled as aggressive or threatening. "Yes, well, we need to verify that with the gate agent," Brian insisted, despite the fact that James had already boarded the plane after having his pass scanned multiple times. A woman across the aisle looked up from her magazine, her eyebrows raised in curiosity. An older man 2 rows ahead turned around to observe the interaction. James felt the weight of their stares, the silent judgment, the question hanging in the air. Did this man sneak into first class? "I'm happy to show you my boarding pass again," James offered, pulling out his phone once more. "And here's my ID as well." He added his driver's license, though no one had asked for it. Experience had taught him to get ahead of these situations when possible. Brian barely glanced at either document. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain calm." "I am perfectly calm," James replied, fighting to keep the frustration from his voice. "I'm simply trying to understand why I'm being questioned about my seat assignment when no one else in this cabin has been approached." A middle-aged woman sitting nearby chimed in. "They didn't ask to see my boarding pass after I sat down." Brian shot her an irritated look before turning back to James. "Sir, this is just standard procedure." "Is it?" James asked. "Because it doesn't seem standard when it's only being applied to me." The cabin had grown quiet now, with several passengers openly watching the interaction. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. A few seemed to be deliberately avoiding, looking in their direction. Lisa, who had been standing slightly behind Brian, leaned forward and whispered something in his ear. Brian nodded and straightened his posture. "Sir, "If you continue to be disruptive, we'll have to take further action," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. James felt a flash of anger, but kept his expression neutral. 20 years in corporate America had taught him how to wear a mask, how to swallow his feelings in moments like these. He was well aware that showing even a hint of the anger he felt would only reinforce whatever stereotypes these flight attendants were operating under. "I'm not being disruptive," James stated calmly. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat responding to questions that only I am being asked. I'd like to speak to the captain or the chief flight attendant, please." Instead of addressing his request, Brian turned and walked to the front of the cabin. He picked up the intercom phone and spoke into it, his eyes still fixed on James. "We need security personnel to the first-class cabin for a disruptive passenger situation." A chorus of murmurs spread through the cabin. James closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. When he opened them, he noticed a young woman across the aisle had taken out her phone and appeared to be recording the situation. She gave him a small nod of support. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his business card, then opened his leather portfolio where he kept extra copies. He was painfully familiar with this drill, the need to quickly establish credentials, to prove he wasn't just some random person who wandered into a space where others thought he didn't belong. As he waited for security to arrive, he sent a quick text to his executive assistant. "Possible situation on Flight 237. Being flagged as disruptive for questioning why only I was asked for boarding verification in first class. Security called. Keep you posted." His assistant replied immediately, "Recording everything. Legal team on standby. CEO of the airline is Michael Peterson, already pulling his contact info." James put his phone away as 2 airport security officers and a police officer walked down the jetway and onto the plane. He sat straight, hands visible on the armrests, expression neutral, a posture he'd adopted countless times when dealing with security guards in high-end stores, police officers who pulled him over in his luxury car, and receptionists who assumed he was in the wrong building when he arrived for executive meetings. The reality of being a black CEO in America meant always being prepared to prove you belonged, even when you were exactly where you were supposed to be. As the officers approached, James took a deep breath. The confrontation was just beginning, but he'd been here before. The difference was that this time, he had the resources and platform to make sure there would be consequences. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. The clock was ticking. In less than 10 minutes, this entire situation would set off a chain of events that none of the flight attendants could have anticipated when they decided to question the well-dressed black man in seat 3A. The 3 officers made their way down the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin. 2 wore the Navy uniforms of airport security, while the 3rd was a police officer, his badge catching the light as he moved. The plane had fallen eerily quiet, the usual pre-flight chatter silenced as passengers watched the scene unfold. James remained perfectly still in his seat, his hands visible on the armrests. Years of navigating similar situations had taught him the unwritten rules of survival: appear non-threatening, speak calmly, make no sudden movements. The police officer reached him first, positioning himself in the aisle while the security officers stood slightly behind. "Sir, I understand there's some kind of issue?" the officer asked, his tone professional but guarded. Before James could respond, Brian stepped forward eagerly. "This passenger is being disruptive and refusing to comply with crew member instructions." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The woman who had been recording looked up from her phone. "That's not what happened," she said, clearly. "They singled him out for no reason." The officer glanced at her, then back at James. "Sir, can I see your ID and boarding pass, please?" "Of course," James replied, handing over both items. "I'm James Taylor, CEO of Horizon Security Solutions. I was asked to verify my seat assignment after I was already seated, despite having my boarding pass scanned at the gate. When I questioned why I was the only passenger being asked to do this, I was labeled disruptive." The officer studied James's ID and boarding pass, then looked at his business card. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Horizon Security Solutions. was a major player in the cybersecurity industry, often contracting with government agencies and Fortune 500 companies. Its CEO was frequently featured in business publications and had recently been profiled in a major news magazine. "Everything seems in order here," the officer said, handing back James's documents. He turned to Brian with a questioning look. What exactly was the issue with his seating? Brian's confidence faltered slightly. We have protocols to follow for security purposes. And these protocols involve checking only certain passengers? James asked quietly. Lisa stepped forward, her cheeks flushed. There was a misunderstanding about company policy. We apologize for any inconvenience. The apology rang hollow, lacking any acknowledgement of what had actually occurred. James had heard similar non-apologies countless times before, words designed to close the matter without addressing the underlying issue. The police officer seemed to sense the tension. He glanced around the cabin, noting the uncomfortable expressions on several passengers' faces and the phones that were now recording the interaction. "Sir," he said to James, "your documentation is in order and you're in your assigned seat. There's no reason for us to be here." He turned to the flight crew. "Is there anything else?" Brian and Lisa exchanged looks. "No, that's all," Brian mumbled, his earlier bravado deflated. As the officers prepared to leave, the captain emerged from the cockpit, alerted to the situation. He was a tall man with gray at his temples, his uniform crisp and authoritative. "What's going on here?" he asked, surveying the scene. The police officer briefly explained the situation. The captain's expression darkened as he listened. "Mr. Taylor," he said, turning to James, "I apologize for this incident. I can assure you it will be addressed." He shot a pointed look at Brian and Lisa before addressing the officers. "Thank you for your time, but your services won't be needed." As the officers departed, the captain spoke quietly to the flight attendants before returning to the cockpit. James could see Brian and Lisa engaged in a heated whispered conversation near the galley. The woman who had been recording put down her phone and leaned across the aisle toward James. "I got everything," she said quietly. "My name's Rachel Chen. I'm a civil rights attorney, and what just happened was textbook discrimination. If you want a witness statement, here's my card." James accepted her card with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you. I appreciate that." Other passengers were watching the exchange. An older gentleman a few rows ahead turned around in his seat. "That was completely unacceptable how they treated you," he said loudly enough for the flight attendants to hear. "I fly this airline every week, and I've never seen them check anyone's boarding pass after seating." A businesswoman across the aisle nodded in agreement. "I've already emailed customer service about what I witnessed. Completely unprofessional." James thanked them both, surprised by the show of support. Too often in these situations, bystanders remained silent, uncomfortable with confronting the reality of what they were witnessing. As the pre-flight preparations continued, a different flight attendant approached James with a glass of water and a sincere apology. "I'm so sorry about what happened, sir. It's not representative of our airline's values." James accepted the water with a nod but said nothing. Values were meaningless without action to back them up. He'd heard too many companies espouse diversity and inclusion while allowing discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked. Once the plane was in the air, James opened his laptop and composed a detailed email. He addressed it to his executive assistant, the airline's CEO, and Horizon's board of directors. He described the incident with precision, attaching the contact information of the passengers who had offered to serve as witnesses. He ended the email with a single sentence. "This incident is not just about two flight attendants. It's about a corporate culture that allows such behavior to exist." After sending the email, James closed his laptop and gazed out the window at the clouds below. The confrontation had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact would be far-reaching. The quiet dignity with which he had handled the situation masked the emotional toll it had taken. These moments, these small daily indignities, accumulated over time like sediment, weighing heavily on the spirit. James thought about his two children at home, how they were growing up in a world where their father, despite all his achievements, could still be humiliated in public simply because of the color of his skin. He thought about the conversation he would have with them tonight, another chapter in the ongoing lesson about navigating a world that wasn't always fair or kind. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from his assistant. Email received and forwarded to legal. Social media already picking up the story. Passenger video has been shared over 5,000 times in the last 20 minutes. Airline CEO's office just called requesting an urgent meeting upon your arrival. James wasn't surprised. In today's world, incidents like this no longer remained hidden. Smartphones and social media had created a new kind of accountability, shining light on behaviors that had previously gone unchallenged. Another message came through, this time from Horizon's head of PR. Channel 7 News, reaching out for comment. How do you want to handle? James typed a response. No comment at this time. Let's see how the airline responds first. This wasn't about publicity for James. It was about accountability and change. Throughout his career, he had faced similar situations. Being mistaken for waitstaff at industry galas, being asked to show extra ID when using his corporate credit card, being questioned when entering high-end buildings where he owned the penthouse. Each time he had weighed his response carefully, knowing that his actions would impact not just himself but others who would come after him. As the flight continued, passengers occasionally stopped by his seat to offer words of support. A flight attendant who hadn't been involved in the initial confrontation made sure his drink was always full and spoke to him with the respect his ticket had purchased, but his skin color had initially denied him. James used the remaining flight time to prepare for what would come next. He researched the airline's history, looking for previous incidents and their responses. He reviewed their diversity and inclusion statements, their training protocols, their leadership structure. By the time the plane began its descent, he had a clear picture of the company's culture and the changes needed to address its systemic issues. What James didn't know was that while he had been in the air, the video of the incident had gone viral, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Hashtags were trending, with business leaders and celebrities expressing support. Journalists were already investigating similar incidents, uncovering a pattern of discriminatory behavior from the airline's staff. And in the corporate headquarters of Skyway Airlines, an emergency board meeting was being called. As the plane touched down, James gathered his belongings, preparing to disembark. The same captain who had intervened earlier approached him before he left. Mr. Taylor, I want to personally apologize again for your experience today. I've filed a formal report, and I want you to know that this is being taken very seriously at the highest levels. James nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing that real change required more than apologies. It required systemic overhaul, accountability, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of such behavior. As he stepped off the plane, James was surprised to see a woman in a business suit waiting at the gate. She stepped forward as he approached. Mr. Taylor, I'm Catherine Williams, Chief Operating Officer of Skyway Airlines. Our CEO has requested an immediate meeting with you. A car is waiting to take us to headquarters if you're willing. James checked his watch. The incident that had begun less than 2 hours ago was already setting wheels in motion. He nodded to Catherine. I'm willing to meet, but I should tell you, this isn't just about an apology. This is about meaningful change. Catherine's expression was solemn. I understand, and so does our board. They've been in emergency session since the video surfaced. She hesitated, then added, the meeting started exactly 10 minutes after the incident on the plane. As they walked toward the exit, James's phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced down to see the headline, Skyway Airlines under fire, viral. Video shows Black CEO harassed by flight staff. The next few hours would determine whether this incident would be just another story of discrimination or the catalyst for real transformation within a major corporation. The sleek black car wound through Atlanta's midday traffic, carrying James and Catherine toward the Skyway Airlines headquarters. Neither spoke much during the ride, both lost in thought about the rapidly unfolding situation. James glanced at his phone, which hadn't stopped buzzing since he'd landed. The video of the incident had exploded online, already viewed more than 1 million times across various platforms. News outlets were picking up the story, and his PR team was fielding calls from journalists around the country. Your CEO is Robert Chen, correct? James asked, breaking the silence. Catherine nodded. Yes. He's been with the company for 8 years. He's waiting for us at headquarters along with several board members. And they called an emergency meeting within minutes of the incident? Yes, Catherine replied. One of our board members was actually on your flight, a few rows behind you. He witnessed everything and immediately called Robert. James raised an eyebrow, surprised by this information. That explains the rapid response. The board member, Dr. Thompson, was quite upset by what he saw, Catherine added, choosing her words carefully. He's been pushing for improved diversity training for months. The car pulled up to a modern glass building with the Skyway logo prominently displayed. Security waved them through without delay, clearly expecting their arrival. As they walked through the lobby, James noticed employees watching him, some with expressions of recognition, others whispering to colleagues. News traveled fast. Catherine led him to an express elevator that whisked them to the top floor. The executive suite was buzzing with activity despite it being weekend. Assistants rushed back and forth with documents while staff huddled around computer screens, likely monitoring the growing social media storm. At the end of the hallway, a large conference room door stood open. Inside, a group of people sat around a polished table, their expressions serious. At the head of the table was Robert Chen, a man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Robert stood immediately when James entered. Mr. Taylor, thank you for coming. I'm Robert Chen, CEO of Skyway. He extended his hand, his grip firm and his gaze direct. I want to begin by offering my sincere apologies for what happened on our flight today. James shook his hand, assessing the man before him. Thank you for the apology, Mr. Chen. I appreciate your prompt response to the situation. Robert gestured to the others in the room. Let me introduce our board members who were able to join us on short notice. He pointed to each person as he named them. Dr. William Thompson, who was on your flight today. Patricia Rodriguez, our head of operations. Jonathan Kim, legal counsel. And Diana Washington, our newly appointed chief diversity officer. James greeted each with a nod, noting the diverse composition of the leadership team. He took special note of Dr. Thompson, a distinguished-looking older black man who had apparently been a silent witness to the entire incident. Please, have a seat, Robert said, gesturing to an open chair. We've been reviewing the videos and statements from passengers. What happened to you today was completely unacceptable, and we take full responsibility. James sat down, placing his briefcase on the table. I appreciate that, but responsibility without action means very little. I'm curious to know what steps you plan to take. Dr. Thompson leaned forward. If I may, Robert. At the CEO's nod, he continued, addressing James directly. I was seated in row 7 today. I saw everything that transpired, and I was both angered and saddened. Angered because in 2025 we're still dealing with this kind of blatant discrimination. Saddened because it happened on an airline where I serve as a board member. He paused, removing his glasses. What you may not know is that we've been pushing for enhanced bias training for months, but it's been slow to implement due to budget constraints and scheduling issues. Today's incident has made it clear that we can no longer afford to delay, Patricia. Rodriguez spoke next. We've pulled the employment records of the flight attendants involved. Both have had previous complaints filed against them for similar behavior. Her expression was grim. These complaints were handled at the middle management level and never escalated to senior leadership. That represents a significant failure in our reporting systems. James listened, taking mental notes. The situation was following a familiar pattern. Incidents treated as isolated problems rather than symptoms of systemic issues. So the infrastructure for reporting these incidents exists, he observed. But the information doesn't flow to those with the power to make meaningful changes? Exactly, Diana Washington confirmed. I was brought on 6 months ago to address these very issues, but I've encountered significant resistance from middle management. They're protective of their teams and reluctant to acknowledge problems that might reflect poorly on their leadership. Robert Chen tapped a folder on the table. We've prepared some immediate actions that we plan to take. First, the termination of the employees involved. He slid the folder toward James. But that's just the beginning. We need to address the root causes, which is why we wanted to meet with you directly. James left the folder unopened. Firing the flight attendants might address this specific incident, but it won't prevent the next one. What about the supervisors, who received previous complaints and did nothing? What about the training systems that failed to correct their behavior? What about the company culture that made them comfortable displaying such bias in the first place? A heavy silence fell over the room. James continued, his voice calm but firm. I'm not interested in seeing 2 employees lose their jobs if nothing else changes. That's not justice. It's scapegoating. Diana nodded vigorously. That's exactly what I've been saying. We need systemic change, not just disciplinary action. Outside the conference room, the office remained in crisis mode. James could see staff monitoring social media feeds, where the hashtag #Skyway discrimination was trending nationally. News vans had begun to gather outside the building, and reporters were requesting statements. Robert Chen seemed to age before. James's eyes, the weight of the crisis evident in his expression. You're right, Mr. Taylor, and that's why we need your help. James raised an eyebrow. My help? Yes, Robert confirmed. We could issue statements, fire the employees, and wait for the news cycle to move on, or we could use this moment to create real, lasting change, not just at Skyway but across the industry. Dr. Thompson nodded in agreement. What happened to you happens to countless travelers every day. They just don't have your platform or resources. Most incidents never make the news or go viral online. They're endured in silence with no accountability. For the first time since the incident began, James felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps some good could come from this after all. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Robert exchanged glances with his team before responding. A partnership. We want to completely overhaul our training programs, reporting systems, and accountability measures. We want you and your company, with its expertise in organizational systems, to help us build something that could become an industry standard. James considered the proposal. Horizon Security Solutions specialized in cybersecurity, but their approach to creating secure systems had applications far beyond technology. They examined how human behavior, organizational structures, and accountability systems interacted to create either vulnerability or resilience. That's an interesting proposition, James said carefully. But before I consider it, I need to understand exactly what happened today, not just on the plane, but afterward. How did this emergency board meeting come about so quickly? Dr. Thompson answered. I witnessed the entire incident. When I saw security being called, I immediately texted Robert and several other board members. I described what was happening in real time. He paused. Then I began making calls. By the time security left the plane, this meeting had already been scheduled. Catherine added. The first video was posted online before the plane even took off. Our social media team flagged it immediately, and Robert called for emergency response protocols. Which explains why you were waiting for me at the gate, James noted, looking at Catherine. She nodded. Exactly. We knew we needed to address this immediately and directly. Jonathan Kim, the legal counsel who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. From a legal perspective, the company's liability is significant. But more importantly, this incident has revealed critical flaws in our systems that need to be addressed regardless of potential litigation. James opened his briefcase and removed his tablet. If we're going to discuss a partnership, I need to be transparent about my next steps. My team has prepared a public statement about today's incident. He pulled up the document. I intended to release it this evening. Robert tensed visibly. May I ask what it says? It details what happened and calls for accountability. It doesn't name the airline yet, pending your response to the situation. James looked around the table. I'm willing to work with you on addressing the systemic issues, but I won't stay silent about what happened. We wouldn't ask you to, Diana assured him. In fact, your voice could be crucial in driving the changes we need to make. Outside the conference room, phones continued to ring incessantly. A staff member knocked urgently on the door, entered and whispered something to Robert, whose expression grew even more serious. The video has now been viewed over 5 million times, Robert informed the group after the staff member left. We're receiving calls from major news networks and several civil rights organizations have issued statements condemning the incident. Patricia checked her tablet. Our customer service lines are being flooded with calls. Many people are threatening to cancel their bookings. The crisis was escalating by the minute, but strangely the atmosphere in the room had shifted from panic to purpose. There was a sense that they stood at a pivotal moment, one that could either destroy the airline's reputation or transform it into a leader for positive change. Here's what I propose, James said, setting his tablet on the table. I'll delay my statement for 24 hours to give you time to prepare a comprehensive response, not just about the employees involved, but about the specific, measurable steps you'll take to address the underlying issues. He continued, in return, I want complete transparency. I want to see all previous complaints against these employees, all relevant training materials, and all diversity initiatives that have been proposed but not implemented. I want to understand exactly how and why the system failed today. Robert looked to his team, receiving nods of agreement from each member. We accept those terms. You'll have everything within the hour. One more thing, James added. Whatever changes we implement need to be measurable and public. No silent settlements, no confidentiality agreements, no burying the results. Real accountability requires transparency. Agreed, Robert said without hesitation. As the meeting continued, delving into specifics of airline procedures and training protocols, James reflected on the strange turn the day had taken. What had begun as a humiliating experience was transforming into an opportunity for meaningful change. The rapid response of the board, particularly the immediate action taken by Dr. Thompson, had been unexpected but heartening. Outside the conference room windows, the afternoon sun illuminated the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere in that city, 2 flight attendants were about to learn that their actions had not only cost them their jobs but had sparked a movement that would reshape an entire industry. The incident had lasted less than 15 minutes. The emergency board meeting had been called just 10 minutes after that. But the changes that would emerge from this day would impact countless travelers for years to come. 10 minutes after the incident on Flight 237 was reported to Skyway's leadership, the airline's boardroom had transformed into a crisis command center. The polished mahogany table was now covered with laptops, tablets, and hastily printed reports. Coffee cups and water bottles cluttered the space as board members and executives worked with intense focus. Robert Chen stood at the head of the table, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. The formal business demeanor had given way to a war room atmosphere. Let's go through this step by step, he said, addressing the assembled team. Dr. Thompson, you witnessed the incident firsthand. Walk us through exactly what you saw. Dr. William Thompson, one of the airline's longest-serving board members, removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I was in row 7, so I had a clear view. The passenger in 3A, who we now know as James Taylor, CEO of Horizon Security, was seated and reviewing documents on his tablet when flight attendant Lisa approached him. Dr. Thompson's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen such incidents too many times before. She specifically asked to see his boarding pass, something she hadn't done with any other passenger in first class. I noticed immediately and started paying attention. He continued detailing the escalation, how Brian had joined Lisa, how they had whispered while looking at James, how they had called security despite James remaining completely calm and reasonable throughout the interaction. It was textbook profiling, Dr. Thompson concluded. And as a black man who has experienced similar treatment countless times, I recognized it immediately. Patricia Rodriguez, head of operations, was reviewing personnel files on her laptop. We've pulled the records for both flight attendants. Lisa Wilson has been with us for 8 years, Brian Cooper for 5. She scrolled through documents, her expression growing more troubled. There have been 3 previous complaints against Lisa for discourteous behavior toward minority passengers, 2 against Brian for similar issues. And how were those complaints handled? Robert asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Patricia grimaced. Standard procedure. Their direct supervisor spoke with them. They received customer service refresher training, and the incidents were marked as resolved. Diana Washington, the chief diversity officer, couldn't contain her frustration. This is exactly what I've been trying to address for months. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of systemic issues that refresher training doesn't fix. Jonathan Kim, the legal counsel, was reviewing the videos that had been posted online. From a legal standpoint, this is indefensible. The discrimination is blatant. Mr. Taylor would have an extremely strong case against us if he chooses to pursue legal action. Robert paced at the head of the table. This isn't just about legal liability. This is a fundamental failure of our values as a company. People trust us to treat them with dignity and respect when they fly with us. Today, we broke that trust. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The reputation Skyway had built over decades was now in jeopardy because of a 15-minute interaction. What's our immediate response? Asked Patricia. Beyond the obvious termination of the employees involved. Diana leaned forward. Termination is necessary but not sufficient. We need to acknowledge the systemic nature of the problem and outline specific steps we're taking to address it. Dr. Thompson nodded in agreement. If we frame this as just 2 bad employees, we're missing the point. The issue is cultural. Robert turned to Catherine Williams, who had just returned from escorting James to a private office where he could review the documents they had promised. What's your sense of Mr. Taylor? Is he looking to punish the airline, or is he open to working with us? Catherine considered the question. He's understandably angry, but he's also thoughtful and strategic. He seems more interested in creating lasting change than in public shaming or financial settlements. That aligns with his reputation, Jonathan noted, scrolling through a profile of James on his tablet. Horizon Security Solutions is known for its progressive corporate culture and community involvement. Taylor has been a vocal advocate for systemic approaches to problem solving. Robert made a decision. Then we give him complete transparency. Full access to our training materials, complaint records, everything. We acknowledge our failures and commit to comprehensive reform. Diana looked skeptical. The executive team has been resistant to my proposed changes for months. Will they suddenly embrace them now because of public pressure? They won't have a choice, Robert said firmly. This is now a board-level mandate. As they continued strategizing, a young staff member entered the room, her expression anxious. Sir, I think you should see this. She handed Robert a tablet displaying a social media feed. The hashtag Boycott Skyway was trending nationally. Thousands of users were sharing the video and vowing never to fly with the airline again. Celebrity influencers with millions of followers were amplifying the message. The stock price had already dropped 3% in after-hours trading. Robert passed the tablet around the table. This is moving faster than we anticipated. We need to get ahead of it. We need to talk to the employees involved. Patricia said, get their side of the story before making final decisions. Jonathan shook his head. From a legal perspective, their actions are clear in the video. Multiple witnesses corroborate what happened. There's no explanation that would justify their behavior. Dr. Thompson's expression was pained. I agree with Jonathan. In my 30 years in corporate America, I've seen this pattern too many times. Organizations look for ways to explain away or minimize discriminatory behavior instead of confronting it directly. The tension in the room was palpable. For some board members, this was primarily a PR crisis to be managed. For others, particularly Dr. Thompson and Diana, it was a moment of moral reckoning for the company. Robert sensed the division and made his position clear. This isn't a debate about whether discrimination occurred. The video evidence is unambiguous. The question is how we respond, not just to save our reputation, but to become the company we claim to be in our mission statement. He pointed to the framed corporate values on the wall, which prominently featured respect for all, and inclusive excellence. We either live by these values or we take them down, he said simply. The boardroom door opened again, and Catherine returned with James. Taylor. The board members straightened in their seats, the atmosphere shifting from internal debate to external accountability. James carried a folder of documents they had provided, personnel records, training materials, and previous complaint reports. His expression was thoughtful but determined. "Thank you for this information," he said, taking a seat at the table. "It's been illuminating." Robert nodded. "We promised transparency. What are your thoughts after reviewing the documents?" James placed the folder on the table. "The pattern is clear. These weren't isolated incidents, and they weren't addressed with the seriousness they deserved. The question is whether Skyway is truly committed to changing that pattern." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. "I've been in corporate America long enough to know how these situations typically play out. The company expresses shock and outrage. They fire the employees directly involved. They make public statements about their commitment to diversity. They might even hire a consultant to conduct a training session." James leaned forward. "And then when the media attention fades, everything goes back to normal. The systemic issues remain unaddressed. Is that what's going to happen here?" The question hung in the air. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Thompson broke the silence. "Not this time." His voice carried the authority of his years and experience. "I've spent too many years watching this cycle repeat itself. Today we break it." Diana nodded vigorously. "I have a comprehensive plan for systemic change that's been sitting on desks for months. It addresses everything from hiring practices to training protocols to accountability systems." "I'd like to see that plan," James said. While Diana pulled up the document on her tablet, Robert addressed the immediate issue. "We've made the decision to terminate both employees involved in today's incident, effective immediately. But as you've pointed out, that's just the beginning." Patricia added, "We're also placing their direct supervisor on administrative leave pending a review of how previous complaints were handled." James nodded, acknowledging these steps, but clearly waiting for more. Diana handed him her tablet, displaying a detailed plan titled Comprehensive Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, a Systems Approach. As James reviewed the document, the board members watched him closely. This man, who had been humiliated on their aircraft just hours ago, now held significant influence over their company's future. After several minutes of reading, James looked. "This is impressive work. Thorough, systemic, measurable." He turned to Diana. "When did you present this to leadership?" 3 months ago, she replied, her frustration evident. It was deemed too costly and logistically challenging to implement all at once. James turned to Robert. "And now?" Robert didn't hesitate. "The board is prepared to approve the full implementation of Diana's plan with an initial budget of $5 million in quarterly progress reviews at the board level." The commitment was substantial, both financially and organizationally. It signaled a genuine shift rather than a superficial response. James nodded slowly. "That's a meaningful start. But implementation is where most initiatives fail. How will you ensure this doesn't become another binder collecting dust on a shelf?" Dr. Thompson leaned forward. "By making it public and measurable, we'll publish quarterly progress reports. We'll establish clear metrics for success. We'll create external accountability through partnerships with civil rights organizations. And," Robert added, "we'd like you and Horizon Security to be part of that external accountability. Your company specializes in creating secure systems. We want you to help us build a secure system against discrimination and bias, one with multiple checkpoints and fail-safes." The proposal surprised James. He had expected apologies and damage control, not an invitation to partnership. He considered the offer carefully, aware of both its potential and its risks. "Such a partnership would need to be completely transparent," he said finally. "No confidentiality agreements that prevent public disclosure of findings. No control over what we can report. Agreed, Robert said without hesitation. James looked around the table again, assessing the sincerity of each person. In Dr. Thompson and Diana, he saw genuine commitment to change. In Robert and the others, he saw at minimum a recognition of necessity, if not moral conviction. One more thing, James said. The employees who were terminated today, what happens to them? The question seemed to surprise the board members. They'll receive standard severance packages as per company policy, Patricia replied cautiously. James shook his head. That's not what I'm asking. What happens to them in terms of education and growth? Are they simply cast out as sacrificial lambs? Or does your commitment to transformation include them as well? Diana's eyes widened with understanding. You're suggesting some form of restorative justice approach? Exactly, James confirmed. Firing them might address the symptom, but it doesn't cure the disease. If Skyway is truly committed to transformation, that should extend to everyone involved, including those who displayed the bias you're working to eliminate. The board members exchanged glances, clearly not having considered this perspective. Dr. Thompson nodded slowly, a new respect for James evident in his expression. That's a challenging proposition, Robert admitted, but one worth exploring. Outside the boardroom, the crisis continued to unfold. Social media outrage was growing. News crews had gathered outside Skyway headquarters. Competitor airlines were already running ads emphasizing their commitment to inclusive service. But inside the room, something unexpected was happening. What had begun as an emergency response to a PR disaster was evolving into a genuine commitment to transformation. The flight attendants who had called security on James would indeed lose their jobs that day, but the impact of their actions would extend far beyond their employment status. In just 10 minutes, their decision had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape an entire corporate culture. James closed Diana's tablet and handed it back to her. I'm willing to work with you on this, not because I believe an apology and a termination notice are sufficient, but because I see the potential for real change here. The relief in the room was palpable. The crisis was far from over, but a path forward was emerging. Thank you, Robert said simply. We have a lot of work ahead of us. James nodded, his expression serious. Yes, we do, and it begins with your public statement, which needs to be more than just an apology. It needs to be a commitment, specific, measurable, and binding. As the board began drafting their public response, James stepped out of the room to call his team at Horizon. The day had taken an unexpected turn, transforming a moment of personal humiliation into an opportunity for systemic change. Sometimes transformation began in the most painful ways. But perhaps that was the nature of real progress, emerging not from comfort but from confrontation, from moments when injustice was too visible to ignore. 10 minutes after the incident on Flight 237, a board meeting had been called. And in that meeting, the seeds of genuine change had been planted. Whether they would grow and flourish remained to be seen, but the ground had been prepared. 6 months had passed since that fateful day on Flight 237. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness as James Taylor made his way through the terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. He wore his usual travel attire, comfortable but professional, and carried a sleek leather briefcase containing his laptop and presentation materials. Today marked his first time flying Skyway Airline since the incident. It was a deliberate choice, timed to coincide with the airline's rollout of its new training program and customer service protocols. As James approached the Skyway check-in counter, he noticed subtle but significant changes. New signage prominently displayed the airline's updated commitment to inclusive service. The staff wore pins with the words "Respect for All" alongside the company logo. But more importantly, he observed the interactions between agents and passengers, attentive, respectful, and consistent, regardless of who stood before them. A young woman at the counter greeted him with a professional smile. "Good morning, sir. May I see your ID and boarding pass?" James provided the requested documents, noting that she asked the same of every passenger in line. Small changes, but meaningful ones. "You're all set, Mr. Taylor," she said, returning his ID. "And I just want to say, the changes you've helped implement here have made a real difference for us frontline staff." "Thank you." James nodded, somewhat surprised by the recognition. "You're welcome. It's been a team effort." As he made his way to the security checkpoint, James reflected on the whirlwind 6 months that had followed the incident. The day after it happened, Skyway Airlines had issued a public statement that went far beyond the typical corporate apology. Robert Chen had personally appeared on camera, acknowledging the discriminatory treatment James had experienced and outlining specific, measurable steps the airline would take to address systemic issues. The statement had been remarkable for its transparency. Rather than minimizing the incident or framing it as an isolated occurrence, Chen had acknowledged the pattern of complaints that had preceded it and the organizational failures that had allowed discriminatory behavior to go unchecked. The two, flight attendants Lisa Wilson and Brian Cooper, had indeed been terminated. But in an unexpected move that generated both controversy and praise, Skyway had offered them a path to redemption through participation in an intensive education program, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations. The program wasn't a guarantee of reemployment, but rather an opportunity for genuine growth and understanding. Lisa had accepted, Brian had not. James boarded the plane, this time without incident. As he settled into his first-class seat, he couldn't help but notice the diversity of the cabin crew, not just in terms of race and ethnicity, but also age, body type, and gender expression. It wasn't window dressing. It was the result of Skyway's revamped hiring practices, designed to build a workforce that reflected the diverse passengers it served. The chief flight attendant, a middle-aged black woman named Teresa, recognized James as he boarded. "Mr. Taylor, welcome aboard. It's an honor to have you flying with us today." James thanked her with a smile. He wasn't looking for special treatment, but the acknowledgement felt like a small victory, a sign that things had indeed changed. 6 months ago, he had been treated with suspicion and hostility in this same cabin. Today, he was welcomed with respect. As the plane prepared for takeoff, James opened his laptop to review his presentation. He was headed to New York to speak at a conference on corporate transformation, specifically the case study that had emerged from his partnership with Skyway Airlines. The initial viral video had been just the beginning. In the days that followed, the story had exploded across traditional and social media, becoming a flashpoint in ongoing conversations about racial bias in America. But unlike many similar incidents that flared briefly before fading from public consciousness, this one had led to tangible, measurable change. The partnership between Horizon Security Solutions and Skyway Airlines had evolved into something neither company had initially envisioned. What began as Crisis M Enagement had transformed into a pioneering approach to corporate diversity and inclusion, one that focused on systems and accountability rather than just awareness and training. James's company had applied its expertise in building secure systems to the challenge of creating an organization resistant to bias. They had implemented multiple checkpoints and fail-safes, redesigned reporting mechanisms, and created new accountability structures that made it impossible for complaints to disappear into administrative black holes. The results had been remarkable. In the 6 months since implementing these changes, Skyway had seen a 70% decrease in customer complaints related to discriminatory treatment. Employee satisfaction scores had risen across all demographic groups. And perhaps most surprisingly, operational efficiency had improved. Proof that treating people with dignity and respect wasn't just morally right, but also good for business. The plane took off, climbing into clear blue skies. James gazed out the window, thinking about how far they had come and how much work still lay ahead. The transformation of Skyway was encouraging, but it was just one company in an industry and a society that still struggled with deeply rooted bias. His phone buzzed with a message from Diana Washington, now Skyway's Senior Vice President of Inclusive Excellence, a promotion that reflected the company's new priorities. CNN just confirmed for next week. They want to do a feature on the 1-year anniversary of the training program rollout. You available to join? James replied affirmatively. The media interest in Skyway's transformation had been sustained, partly because the airline had taken the unusual step of complete transparency throughout the process. They had published quarterly progress reports, shared both successes and setbacks, and invited external evaluation of their efforts. This transparency had initially made Skyway's legal team nervous. Admitting failures and inviting scrutiny carried risks, but it had ultimately benefited the company, building trust with customers and employees alike. Other airlines had taken notice, with several reaching out to implement similar changes. Midway through the flight, Teresa approached James's seat. "Mr. Taylor, our captain would like to speak with you when you have a moment. He was one of the first to go through the new training program you helped develop." James followed her to the cockpit, where Captain David Gonzalez greeted him warmly. "Mr. Taylor, I wanted to thank you personally. I've been flying for 30 years and I've seen how this industry treats people who don't fit a certain mold. What you've helped create here, it's changing the culture from the inside out." "I appreciate that," James replied. "But the credit really belongs to people like Dr. Thompson and Diana Washington, who were pushing for these changes long before I came along. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create the momentum for change that should have happened anyway." "True enough," the captain acknowledged. "But not everyone would have channeled that moment the way you did. Most people would have just sued the airline, taken a settlement, and moved on." James smiled slightly. "Don't think my legal team didn't suggest exactly that. But I've been fighting these battles my whole career. At some point, you get tired of just putting out fires. You want to change the system that keeps starting them." Back in his seat, James returned to his presentation. The title slide read, "Beyond Diversity Training, Building Anti-Bias Systems That Work." The presentation detailed the approach they had developed at Skyway, one that went beyond awareness to focus on structures, incentives, and accountability. The key insight had been treating bias like any other organizational risk, something to be managed through robust systems rather than just individual awareness. Just as companies built security systems to protect against data breaches, they could build inclusion systems to protect against bias. As the plane began its descent into New York, James received another message, this one from Robert Chen. "Board approved the industry initiative unanimously. We're ready to take this beyond Skyway." The initiative Chen referenced was perhaps the most ambitious outcome of the past 6 months, a coalition of airlines committed to implementing similar changes across the industry. What had begun as one company's crisis response was evolving into an industry-wide transformation. After landing, James made his way through JFK Airport, where signs of the initiative were already visible. Training materials that had been developed for Skyway were being adapted for other airlines, reporting kiosks where passengers could provide immediate feedback on their experience stood at regular intervals throughout the terminal. Outside, a car waited to take James to his hotel. The driver, a middle-aged man with a Caribbean accent, recognized him immediately. "You're the CEO from that airline video, right? Man, that was something. My daughter showed it to me. She's in business school, wants to be just like you someday." James smiled, struck by how a moment of humiliation had transformed into something inspiring for others. "Tell your daughter I said to aim even higher." At the hotel, James was greeted by Dr. William Thompson, who had become a close friend and ally over the past months. The older man embraced him warmly. "How was the flight?" Dr. Thompson asked as they walked toward the conference room where they would be speaking. "Different," James replied simply. "Very different." Dr. Thompson nodded, understanding all that was conveyed in that single word. "You know what amazes me most about all this? That board meeting happened just 10 minutes after I called Robert. 10 minutes that changed everything." "It's rare," James acknowledged. "Usually these things get buried in committees and consultations until the moment for real change has passed." "True," Dr. Thompson agreed, "but I think that's changing. People are realizing that these incidents aren't just PR problems to be managed. They're symptoms of deeper issues that affect everything from employee morale to customer loyalty to the bottom line." They paused outside the conference room, where hundreds of business leaders had gathered to learn about Skyway's transformation. Through the doors, James could hear the buzz of conversation, the energy of people eager for change. "Ready?" Dr. Thompson asked. James nodded. Ready. As they entered the room, a hush fell over the crowd. These were CEOs, diversity officers, human resource executives, people with the power to implement similar changes in their own organizations. James took his place at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. 6 months ago, he had been just another black man being humiliated in public because of the color of his skin. Today, he stood before hundreds of business leaders as an architect of transformation. 6 months ago, he began, I boarded a plane and was treated like I didn't belong there. Today I want to talk about belonging, not just as a feeling, but as something we can engineer into our organizations through deliberate systemic change. The audience leaned forward, captivated. James continued, What happened to me that day happens to countless people every day. The difference was that I had the platform and resources to do something about it. The question before us today is, what will you do with your platform and resources? As James spoke about systems and accountability, about metrics and incentives, about the hard work of real change, he thought about Lisa Wilson, the flight attendant who had first questioned his presence in first class. She had recently completed the education program and written him a letter of apology that showed genuine reflection and growth. He thought about Brian Cooper, who had rejected the opportunity for growth and instead become a minor celebrity in certain corners of the internet, portraying himself as a victim of cancel culture. His path forward would be harder, but perhaps one day he too would understand the impact of his actions. Most of all, James thought about that moment on the plane, the humiliation, the anger, the weariness of yet another battle in a lifelong war. He had channeled those feelings into something constructive, something that might spare others the same experience. Real change, he told the audience, happens when we move beyond awareness to accountability. When we build systems that make doing the right thing the easy thing, the default thing, the thing that happens automatically without requiring heroic effort or intervention. In the back of the room, a young black woman in a flight attendant's uniform listened intently. She had joined Skyway Airlines just 3 months ago, part of the new wave of hires brought in under the transformed hiring practices. For her, the changes James was describing weren't abstract concepts but daily realities that made her work life dramatically different from what her predecessors had experienced. As James concluded his presentation, the room erupted in applause. Questions followed, thoughtful, challenging questions from leaders genuinely interested in implementing similar changes in their own organizations. Later that evening, James stood by the window in his hotel room, looking out at the New York skyline. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Skyway Airlines leads industry coalition for inclusive service standards. He smiled slightly, thinking about how differently things might have turned out if the video hadn't gone viral, if Dr. Thompson hadn't been on that flight, if Robert Chen hadn't called an emergency board meeting within minutes of learning about the incident. Small decisions, small moments that changed everything. His phone rang, his daughter calling from college. Dad, I just saw you on the news again. Are you really speaking at the UN next month? Looks that way, James confirmed. They're interested in how private sector changes can support broader social transformation. That's amazing, she said, her voice full of pride. All because you stood up for yourself that day. No, James corrected gently. All because a lot of people decided that standing up for what's right was more important than protecting the status quo. After saying goodnight to his daughter, James returned to the window. Below, the city pulsed, with life, millions of individual stories unfolding simultaneously. How many included moments like he had experienced on that plane? How many didn't end with emergency board meetings and institutional change? The work was far from finished. One airline's transformation, however impressive, was just the beginning, but it was a start. Proof that change was possible when people in power chose accountability over defensiveness, transformation over damage control. 10 minutes after James had been humiliated on Flight 237, a board meeting had been called. And in those 10 minutes, the trajectory of countless lives had been altered. Sometimes transformation happened that way, not through grand proclamations or sweeping legislation, but through individual decisions made in critical moments. The choice to make that call. The choice to convene that meeting. The choice to see a crisis not just as a problem to be managed, but as an opportunity for genuine change. Tomorrow, James would board another Skyway flight, returning to Atlanta. And for the first time in his professional life, he would board that plane without the weight of wondering how he would be treated, without the need to prove he belonged in the seat he had paid for. It was a small victory in a long struggle. But as he had learned throughout his career, those small victories, accumulated over time, were how the world changed. One flight, one company, one industry at a time.